Yeah.
We're live. Hey, everyone. Welcome. This is Rob Dalrymple with Danny again. We want to thank you for joining us today as we continue our conversation on race and racism in the church. And Danny, we're having this conversation, give me your thoughts here, because we believe it's important to understand what motivates people politically, what motivates people ideologically and culturally. Why don't you kind of begin by, why do you think we're having this conversation? Let me start there.
Yeah. Well, like I mentioned last week in our live stream, the first one, the discussion we had on this topic,
Yeah.
it's a deeply personal thing to me because I grew up in the South in the civil rights era. I participated, as I told the stories last week, in the desegregation of a couple of churches. I pastored a church in rural Mississippi as a young man in the late 70s, early 80s. I kind of grew up around this issue. It was always part of my culture, my upbringing. And whenever I think about this issue, I think about one particular story, if I might share it real quickly.
Sure.
When I was growing up in my church, it was a Baptist church in the suburbs of Atlanta in the South. And it was completely segregated. I mentioned last week it was desegregated during my high school years officially. But we didn't have, it was still an all-white congregation. And there was a man that worked for our church. He was the janitor. He was an African-American, a black man who was the janitor. And he had a real heart to try to learn, and he had a heart for God. And on Sunday mornings, he would dress in a suit, beautifully dressed up in a suit. His wife would dress in her Sunday finest, and had two little kids that they would dress up in their Sunday finest. And they would come to our church, and they would sit downstairs in the fellowship hall by themselves and listen in the overflow speakers because they didn't feel welcome in the sanctuary. And we walked by them so many Sundays when he was sitting down there with his family, and he never felt welcome or it was appropriate for him to go upstairs and actually worship with the congregation. Wow. Now, fast forward a few years. Right after I graduated from high school, for 3 summers, after high school graduation, the first 2 summers after my freshman, sophomore year of college, I worked for my best friend back then's dad. And we worked doing landscaping for a very high-end condo complex, apartment complex. And this same guy now was working at that complex. So I worked with this guy, this black man. He was on the team that worked at that for them. And by then, though, he listened to preachers on the radio all the time, and he got caught up in a cult.
Oh.
And he eventually lost his marriage, gave away a ton of money to this cult.
Oh.
And would talk to us. I was a brand new Christian at this point, just start getting, I've been a church kid my whole life. And he would talk to us about this cultic leader he was following, and he listened to literally religiously every day. As I got older, I look back on that. I wonder, how did this guy, if he'd ever felt welcome in our congregation, because he wanted to be a part of a spiritual experience, but we segregated him downstairs, and we all thought it was real cute that he dressed up and got his family there, and that wonderful. But he was never made to feel welcome as part of our church. And a few years later, he's involved in a cult. His marriage has fallen apart because of that, and he's impoverished his own family and himself a little bit because of the money he gave away to it. And it's kind of always stuck in my heart and mind. What would have happened to him and his family if we'd have nurtured his faith and invited him to be a part of our fellowship? Right. But he was black. It's a black family, and we didn't do it. So now I don't blame us for every choice he made, but I've always wondered how many stories out there are people who our actions like that have marginalized them to the point where they have made choices that weren't good ones. They might not have made had they been allowed to be a part of a thriving
community. Yeah.
So that's why are we having this conversation? Because it matters. That it's not about settling a political score or winning ports and that. It's about real, actual human beings who are hurt by this.
Right.
And the fact that across our history, And even today, still, people are hurt by these things.
Right.
So, yeah. And one of the questions that comes to me, Rob, is that people say, well, that was, that's way back in the past. That happened a long time ago. What about now? Certainly things are better. I would not argue at all that we haven't made progress. I think we have in lots of ways. Certainly there are a lot of incredible multi-ethnic churches. I'm not arguing that today is just like then. I am arguing that we need to let ourselves to be uncomfortable with this history, with these things, and ask ourselves, where are there still the residual problems that come from this history that we as the body of Christ need to be aware of and address? Okay. Well, that's why I'm having this conversation.
Yeah. And we even laid a foundation for some of that last week. Yeah. I think that I would add to that the commission for God's people is to be the image bearers of Christ.
Absolutely.
To follow the Lamb in loving, sacrificially dying for the sake of the other, and to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And love, of course, is not some feeling of like and happiness towards everybody, but it's work, and it's this sacrificial love for the sake of the other. And I think to love them well means that we understand them well, and to understand them, we need to hear their stories.
Yes.
I don't think we can advocate unless we know their stories. So a quick anecdote here, Danny. I'm not sure what year it was. The Ferguson, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, 2017, something like that there. I think I might even have it here. 2014. Okay, there you go. 2014. And I was pastoring as the lead pastor now in Bakersfield, as you know. And I'm thinking, okay, I got to address this from the pulpit. I mean, this is a race riot in Ferguson, and our country. This is a topic of our country. I think I can't just ignore this. And so I called a good friend who's Bishop Ronnie Crudup, and Bishop Crudup in Mississippi. Has been a good friend. I worked with him for a number of years on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we met a number of times in Washington, D.C., became really good friends. My daughter, by the way, went to D.C. one time, and Bishop Crudup kind of gave like one of the keynote speeches, and it was this powerful sermon. The sermon was based on the book of Psalms. And she says, like, there'll be sunshine in the morning, or it's like this glorious hope, right? And my daughter wrote in a marker on my Jeep door the words to his sermon. And by the time it was on the passenger door, by the time I noticed it, I couldn't quite get it off. It took me years to kind of get that marker off the door, but nonetheless. So I called Bishop Crudup, and I said, Bishop, here's the deal. I said, I'm a white man. I don't understand what's going on. Why are they rioting? Michael Brown was shot. It seems to me from what I know that he had robbed a store. He had committed a crime. And I said, help me understand what's going on. And I'm telling you, Bishop Crudup spoke to me for an hour. It's like a Saturday night, and he's got church on Sunday as well. Spoke to me for an hour and just started telling me stories and helping me understand the Black experience. And I'm like, I didn't know any of this. And one of his points was Michael Brown was shot walking away in the back, and the police officer doesn't have the right to be the judge and the jury. And I'm like, he says, but this is what happens, and the revolt, and they're responding to hundreds of years of oppression, and it just really helped me understand a lot. And I think that's kind of why I think we need to have this conversation. And we're two white guys, like, okay, let's lay the foundation for what we understand people are experiencing, and I think that's there. Right, so, Danny, now the next thing, this kind of the elephant in the room becomes the fact that many of our viewers are going to be uncomfortable. We're resistant. I have been. I can tell you. Me too. I can tell you why I think we're resistant. But let me kind of, if you'll speak to that a little bit, this tension, this resistance, this hesitance about the white viewer hearing this stuff and their responses or whatever. What would you say to that and to them who are listening?
I can only kind of speak from my own perspective. I have been extremely uncomfortable at times. I've read books. I've attended conversations. I've listened to these people talk about this, and my first reaction is always what emotionally and I think intellectually comes up to mind is, I am not a racist.
Right.
And by that, I mean, I do everything I can to do these things we're talking about, to understand. I've never, I don't disparage or dehumanize these people, anybody from a different ethnic group. I mean, I try to do all the right thing. I try to be the right kind of person. When I say that, what I am failing to explore is to truly understand the experience of the other.
Right.
And to enter into it with empathy and love, and also to understand more clearly the ways that I have benefited
Right.
by my whiteness. Now, in privilege, I believe that sometimes this rhetoric is overdone in the other direction. I
Okay.
can fully believe that sometimes that's true. I think as I've said before, I don't think race is everything.
Right.
But I think as a white person, it's very easy for me to just want to say I'm not that way, and not realize that I actually am who I am because of a lot of privilege.
Yeah.
And a lot of and there are other factors, socioeconomic and others, that can contribute to that. I own that as well. But I do think that we don't understand, as you said, we don't hear their stories, we don't understand, and we're very, very, very quick to want to rationalize or explain away their stories.
Yes, right.
So that we feel more comfortable. And that's where that's how I've experienced all of this. And so I try to humbly listen and learn from this. I think on Thursday, when we interview our friends, my friends Pat and Barack, you're going to hear in their story, their journey in this, particularly Pat, who's the white pastor who is partnering with in this multi-ethnic endeavor, what he's learned over time in their relationships. And he's got a really up front row seat to how he's had to grow in this area from what we're talking about here. So I think for me, it's being willing to say, I need to be okay being uncomfortable so that I can allow the other to be heard.
Yeah. Very good. And Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 Eastern time, we'll have another live stream. You can find the link for that on the Determined Truth YouTube page. You can also find the link for that on the determinedtruth.com homepage. Of course, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you should be, and click the alerts button, you should be automatically alerted when new episodes are going to release. And next week, we're going to have a live stream. I'm hoping next week we'll have a live stream. We haven't scheduled it exactly yet, talking about a ministry that works towards helping prisoners coming out of the prison system and getting their life back and getting this together. Just a wonderful ministry. Hoping to do that. And we have several other conversations on prisons, as well as maybe even the race conversations as well. And Danny, one of the things that when people talk about Israel, Palestine, as I've discussed a lot, one of the things I say is, you need to go meet Israelis. You need to go meet Jewish people. You need to go meet Palestinians and hear their story.
Absolutely.
Because it's so easy to sit there and talk about the facts of the war, who started this, who started that, what's just, what's right, fitting it through my theological grid of this or that. And you dehumanize it, or political. Yeah, exactly. And then and reality is, no, these are people. I've been in Israeli homes. I've spent the night in Palestinian homes. I've had Israelis spend the night in my homes. I've had Palestinians spend the night in my homes. And you hear, and they're human beings, and they want to live in peace, and they can live in peace, and they're willing to. I think it's the powers that be. So on that level of uncomfortableness, one of the first books that I read, Danny, was Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow.
That's a great book.
It really is kind of like one of the places to start.
Yes.
And I'm telling you, I read
highly recommend it.
Yeah, highly recommend. I'll put the link to it in the notes or whatever on the comments box here once we finish up. I read the first chapter and maybe started the second chapter, and it was too much. I just couldn't continue. I had never heard this. I never understood this. And I put it down, and I bet I put it down for a year. And I finally went, I think I need to read the rest of this book now. And it was hard to process. And I think the other reason why I think we're having this conversation, Dan, and I think you'd agree as well, is because the church has been culpable in this as well. Whether we talked about this on our conversation earlier about abortion, that the church was complicit, in the segregation. We were complicit in slavery by saying, oh, the Bible's, we find these ways to justify it. And I think we need to come up and say, as a church, this is not right. Were you going to add something there?
No, I think I agree with you 100%. I think that the church's role in this, we think about the gospel and race. We think about these things. The Paul writes the book of Ephesians, the core issue is the bringing down the wall between Jew and Gentile. Those are ethnic differences that they're both ethnic and theological. They're faith communities, and even if they're pagan faiths, they're these Gentile, and then the merging of that together under the in the church. It was a struggle. They struggled as we struggle with those kinds of same barriers. And Paul saying the church is actually the showcase of God's new humanity, where all these barriers are broken down. And so if you look at, in Galatians, where he gets in Peter's face, because
Galatians 1.
And
Galatians 2.
Galatians 2. And Peter gets and starts and only eats with the Jews. And he's like, "What are you doing?" I mean,
I rebuked him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Yeah,
exactly. Because he was this idea that we can recede back into our ethnic enclaves, our comfort zones in this, and not see the call of the church to be this new humanity. It was an affront to Paul. It was an affront to the gospel. So I think that's why we have these conversations. We've got to ask ourselves, what do we need to repent of? What do we need to then what steps we need to take from this point on?
Yeah, and we were going to kind of go there next, and that is the positive side of this, and you already addressed it, the gospel and the race. And I would add to that, and I think you're kind of framing it in the same context here, that it starts when we understand the story, the biblical story, as a large story from beginning to end, from garden to garden, as I like to say, the Garden of Eden to the Garden of the New Jerusalem. And there's gardens everywhere in the middle too, by the way, that it begins with the fact that we are all made in God's image. And I think we all say that and know that. But what was actually significant about that at the time it's written in its Old Testament context or ancient Near Eastern context is that in the ancient world, only the kings were made in the image of God.
Right.
The biblical story not only says all humanity is made in the image of God, but includes women, which is really actually revolutionary because ancient creation accounts don't describe the formation of women either. But you start with the fact that we're all made in the image of God. And then you go to the end of the story. And I think there's no question when we get to the New Jerusalem that no one's going to deny that there's an equality between gender, race, socioeconomic. We're all one in Christ Jesus, as Paul would say. So the story starts with this equality and it clearly ends with this equality. But I think what you see then, as Paul says, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor female nor female. Galatians 3:28, obviously Ephesians 2 that you cited, he broke down the barrier. What Paul's saying is that new creation is already begun in God's creation. He's creating this one new humanity. And so we are to live in accordance with that. Now, I get the fact that, if you're a Vietnamese immigrant and you're new to our country, you might go to a Vietnamese church because that's the community maybe they speak your language. I get that we have these segregated churches because they speak. But ultimately, the body of Christ is this unified body that we're one. And I think we have got to stop making this us, them distinctions, whatever it may be, and move past that. So I think that's why I would say that it matters. So the next thing then, Danny, would be we laid a foundation last time for saying that education is one of the primary ways out of poverty. And there's discrimination and maybe racial prejudice in the educational system. Yeah. And housing is the primary way to wealth for the lower middle class or middle class American. And there was racial discrimination in the housing. And so that inhibited, and those two go together because housing and property taxes is a primary contributor to the school system. Yeah. So that's contributed to this injustice that we see there. But I think we need to lay a foundation a little bit kind of historically to say that there has been this thread of injustice throughout that we haven't fully overcome. And I don't think either one of us are saying, and here's the solution now. We need to go to this or affirmative act. We're not going down those paths. We're simply saying to know our neighbor better, we need to understand our neighbor better. Yes. So let me begin by noting this, Danny, that I think I might have mentioned this last time, that when I was just naive, and I'm a history major from Cal State Hayward, right? That's my bachelor's degree. I just assumed that when the 13th Amendment was passed, that the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War ended, 1865, 13th Amendment's there, no more slavery, that just ended it all, and it was all better. And as I said last time, I never thought about the fact that we justified the slavery by inherent racism, and that was bred within us. and that sinful proclivity to think that way wasn't eradicated there. But I never knew this, and I'm not sure when you figured this out or when you first learned this, but there was a loophole in the 13th Amendment.
Yep.
So the 13th Amendment outlaws slavery, except it says, except for prisoners.
Yep.
And I'm like, oh, that ain't good. Right? Now you think, okay, well, no big deal. It's like, yeah, no, prisoners shouldn't be enslaved either. But what happened shortly thereafter, we talk about the era of Reconstruction, which I didn't know a lot about because I wasn't a good high school student. But, that right after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the war, that, there was a period of thriving. And we'll talk about that a little bit with the Tulsa issue there. There's a period of thriving for Blacks and communities like that. But all of a sudden, then whites instituted a practice called peonage or convict leasing.
Yep.
And the 13th Amendment says, the exception says, quote, except as a punishment for crime. In other words, slavery is outlawed except as a punishment for crime. And what happened is they began going, well, how can we imprison these people? So peonage was a form of debt slavery. Correct. Where an employer would compel a worker to pay off a debt by working, and it became a form of slavery. And of course, you have ways of essentially enslaving the Black debtors by charging them high interest rates or by making them rent tools to work on your land. And here, the land that they were formerly slaves on, they're working now to pay off a debt, and there's almost no way out of this debt.
No.
But convict leasing just took it to another whole level, because what happened was, and it's worse than slavery, because what happened in convict leasing was you would imprison somebody. They made laws like loitering is against the law, and so if a person gets laid off and they're loitering outside the store, they get arrested. And of course, it was enforced against people of color more than whites. And then you would go to the sheriff and say, "Hey, sheriff, I need a convict to work on my farm for the next couple of months," and you would lease from the sheriff. Yes. Now, this person, however, like before, when they were slaves, you owned them, which is bad enough itself. But that's a value to you. That to replace that slave is going to cost you money to buy another one. So there's a sense where you have, I might treat you harshly to be less than everybody else, but I'm going to be careful about that, right? Because you're all property and value. But when they're leased and you abuse someone and they die, you just go to the sheriff and say, "I need another one." And this unbelievable system, they found mass graves next to some of the prisons where these convicts were. It was an incredible system, and I think that led to a book. I can't remember the guy's name right now. I want to say Jamar Tisby, but I'm not sure if that's right. Where Slavery by Any Other Name, right? And it's still slavery. So I found that crazy. So Danny, you are familiar with the issue of sharecropping and the injustices with that.
Yeah. More with the aftermath of it. I grew up like I said in suburbs of Atlanta during the civil rights, and so I kind of understood the dynamics of the Black-white relationships in urban area, in the city, in and around Atlanta. I kind of agree with that. But then, as a young minister in my late 20s, mid 20s actually, I was 26 years old when I became the pastor of a church in rural Mississippi.
Okay.
And what at the time that I was there was the poorest per capita income county in the United States.
Wow.
And I was so naive about this whole environment of what I learned, that there was a whole different level of this stuff in the rural South than what I'd grown up with in the more urban South.
Okay, because you grew up in Atlanta.
I grew up in Atlanta. It was much more of the urban issues were front and center, but not the rural issues. And so I got a quick education in so many things during my years living in rural Mississippi. And in that time, there was so much poverty in the Black community. You'd see houses out in the kind of rickety shack-like homes that some Black families were living in poverty out on the farms. They did work. The residual thing of the sharecropping was, it was like you described before. The owner of the land would hire these, and you would work on the land, and they would get a percentage of the crop, the yield for your wage. And Sometimes you were given a little bit of a plot of land around your homestead to maybe make a garden, to get some food, to raise some food. But the problem was then you were complete. It was a disproportionately small percentage of the yield, obviously, in comparison to the amount of labor that these people would put in. Plus, as you said, they would have to get their supplies, everything associated with it, they would purchase from the owner, and then they would incur debt. And so they were in cycles of poverty they could not break out of. There was no opportunity for them to do anything else. And I learned that for instance, cotton was still one of the two predominant crops when I lived there. And I recognize this is 45 years ago when I'm talking about I'm living there, but soybean and cotton were the two predominant crops. And a cotton crop takes about 90 labor days of labor to produce. And a lot of it was more and more mechanized in terms of the harvesting, but there was still some labor that was involved in it. And so it meant for underemployment, as things went forward, there was a lot of underemployment for those who were trying to work on the farms. So what happens over time is just there's no advancement. There is advancement in technology, so there's more mechanization, but there was the educational, it all fed together. The educational system was poor. It was the ability to buy land was not there. So they created this ongoing, perpetuating system of poverty that was very difficult to break out of. Now, we mentioned last week in terms of our books, the book we recommended, The Warmth of Other Suns, was a great book. And part of what they talk about is the Great Migration. I mean, that's the premise of the book. Part of what happens is there's no work, there's no future, most people, I did not realize that most of the ghettos we have in our major cities, particularly in the North, were the results of the impoverishment of Blacks in the South who had no future. Okay. They couldn't get out of the cycles of poverty because the sharecropping thing was just a constant debt to the owner. And so for them to get any kind of future, they would leave and go. But the promise of it was kind of interesting. When I lived in rural Mississippi, when white people talked about going to the city, they meant Memphis, which was 60 miles north of us. You go up to Memphis, we're going up to the city to shop. When a Black person in Irish said, we're going to the city, they meant Chicago. The city was Chicago, because that's where their relatives had all migrated to out of that part of the country. So it was a system of impoverishment where the landowner had control. Now, to be fair in this discussion, this was a phenomenon that was also a burden placed on poor white people too. If you ever read the story of the migration of like the Okies to, sort of the John Steinbeck stuff of there was poor white people that were caught up in the same sort of system where the owner of the land impoverished his workers, and in these cycles of poverty because they owed what was called the company store. You owed to the company store.
Yeah, you load 16 tons, and what do you get?
Well,
another day older and deeper in debt.
Well, it was widespread among the Blacks population in the South, but it did hit poor whites as well. So there's a socioeconomic part to this. But it was more pervasive for the Black community because their whole socioeconomic, it was that status of poverty was much broader percentage of the Black population than it was the white. But powerful people have exploited other humans always, and we've done that. And I think where we see is when I learned in my time in Mississippi was that the churches were deeply segregated and suspicious, and there was it was that suspicion of and inferiority, sort of superiority inferior complex was still very part of the psyche of that culture that I moved into. Now, one of the things I always caution myself is it is also true that things have changed. There are things that are better. But I don't think we recognize how much there are still residual hindrances that people of color experience in our country that still hamper mobility, thriving, and the church hasn't always stepped into the gap on that, and sometimes it's helped perpetuate it.
Yeah, and I think it's deeper than we realize. I remember, just as a passing note, Mako Nagasawa in our live stream on abortion just made that reference to the fact that Black women die in childbirth at much higher rates. You start going down this list. You're like, wait a minute, this is this should not be happening in the 21st century America. All right, so Danny, one of the things that struck me, we saw the racial riots 2020, 2021. I don't remember exactly the year, but right around those times there during the COVID and after that. And some of the riots became violent. And I remember a lot of people in my community going, I understand why they're revolting and against oppression. I get that. But once they start burning businesses down, once they start doing, they're harming other people, that's where I draw the line. And I'm like, okay, I get it. I don't think either one of us would condone violence or injustice against anyone. I mean, we've been speaking about this with Israel, Gaza. And we don't condone this in any way, shape, or form. But I don't think that people understand enough, A, the level of oppression, number one. Number two, that the efforts under unbelievably difficult circumstances to be nonviolent. Like Martin Luther King Jr. was just like incredible, right? I mean, sure, he had his problems, but the pressure upon him, the United States government was tapping his phones and the FBI was, I mean, just everything he did was being watched. Like, wow, how do you do that? How do you keep your cool in that situation? In that one speech that he talks about with, his daughter asking, why can't we go to the carnival? Why can't we go to Fun Town? Like, because it's not made for black girls. It's like, how do you do that when it's your kids? But that's one. Secondly, the fact that when we know from just human nature, when the oppressed are oppressed so deeply, they're going to come out with violence. And that we're not justifying the violence. We're saying, let's address not their response per se, without denying it, but let's address the underlying injustice that causes that response. Let's address both and not just dismiss them. Well, okay, you know what? I'm not listening anymore because they're burning businesses down. Like, that's even more reason to listen to them. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't be held accountable. I just think that that's an issue there. And then the other thing that's interesting to me, and I did not know this, I don't know when you learn about this as well, is that much of the violence in America's racial history was actually whites against blacks. Obviously, we can discuss the lynchings and things of that nature. So I don't know when you first heard about the Tulsa riots. For me, it was only a couple of years ago. But what do you know about the Tulsa riots? And can you kind of fill us in on that story there and what happened?
I learned about the Tulsa riots probably maybe 10 years ago.
Okay.
But one of the most telling, I think I may have mentioned this to you before, but George Will, the conservative columnist, who's in his 80s now, made a statement, I don't know, probably 5 years ago, I'm going to say.
Okay.
And he's a private school, prep school, and Ivy League educated man who's been a pundit and commentating on American society and politics for his entire adult life. And deep into his 70s, approaching his 80s, he said, for the first time in my life, I've heard about the Tulsa riots. So how does a man of that level of education and that man who studied American history and has commented on the social fabric of our country, when he said that, I go, okay, now I know why I never heard about it. And
all right. Let me interject really quickly. So if you're watching this, whether live or not live, later, whatever, I want you to make a comment in the comments box whether you've ever heard of the Tulsa riots before, and if so, when you first heard of them. Yeah. And if it's not until now, then it's like, I never heard of this. So all right, go ahead.
Well, back in the teens and early 20s, 1900 and 2020s, there was a thriving Black business community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a particular district that was called the Greenwood District. And it was a community that had been created intentionally for African Americans by an affluent, rich Black man by the name of O.W. Gurley. He began to create an environment, an economic environment where these people could thrive and have possibilities of earning money and building wealth and perhaps to break the cycles of poverty. And the whole area became known as the Black Wall Street. And it was a highly successful business community run by Blacks, and where they were beginning to prosper, and they were creating for themselves a foundation of wealth making. And
it was a pretty large community, right?
Yes, it was. It was a large community, but it was seen by many of the whites of the area as a threat. They're getting too many, too powerful, too wealthy, and so a whole gang of white people came into the city and basically destroyed it. And at the end of May, over an 18-hour period, at the end of May, 1st of June in 1921, white rioters destroyed 35 city blocks, killed several hundred people, injured more than 800, and left more than 9,000 people homeless. It was the violence against African Americans, and that they basically destroyed the entire economic. The whole Black Wall Street was gone overnight. It got more inflamed because one of the local newspapers suggested that the Ku Klux Klan could be the ones that would restore order, and so they would be like the adjunct policing of it, and it just created it's a tragedy that it doesn't get told in the telling of racial history of our country, hardly at all. It's beginning to get a little bit. I mean, in the last 10 years, it's gotten more of a profile, but it's one of those dark places. And again, we say that's 100 years ago. Well, yes, it's 100 years ago, but it's indicative of a historic pattern in our country where people of our minorities, particularly in this case, Black Americans, were denied access to that which defines us as a country, which was to be, personal. We pride ourselves on personal responsibility, on the freedom to pursue and create a peace, life for ourselves. These were not Blacks who were causing any trouble other than that they were becoming wealthy or were becoming self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And that was seen as a threat to the white people around them, and they destroyed this city. Right. And you can, like you said, there's so much racial violence that permeated our country in the 100 years from the end of the Civil War to the Civil Rights Act of the 60s. So that 100-year period was a period of great deal of violence against Blacks, of systematic and systemic limiting their opportunities.
Right.
It was the ones we talked about last week in terms of education and housing, and then instances like this. And so when you get to fast forward to the Black Lives Matter movement, when white people recoiled at the violence there, like you said, they make, cross the line when and yes, we would immediately say we do not condone violence, but we understand that, like all of these things, there is a broader context, and there's a history of violence of white on Black violence that is part of the historic fabric and the story of the Black experience in our country. That's very difficult and uncomfortable for us sometimes to confront. So again, as you say, we're not offering solutions here tonight. We are merely saying, I think sometimes for me, the best thing that I can do is just stop and listen and weep. And mourn and acknowledge the pain that so many of our fellow citizens have encountered across our history. And it motivates me when I sit with that discomfort. It motivates me to pray and to say, what can I do to make now to more openly and assertively live out and express the kingdom of God and its values. So that's kind of my take on that.
Dan, I don't know if you've ever been to DC and you've been to the new Museum of African American History. Have you?
I've not been to the museum. I have not been to the museum.
It's new. And by the way, we're focusing primarily in this conversation on history of race in terms of African Americans and Blacks. There's no doubt that Latinos, that Asians and other ethnicities have all struggled as well. We don't want to dismiss that or sideline that. We're kind of focusing the conversation on this particular part primarily. By the way, Vinny and I did a podcast. I should have looked up the date on this, but with Russell Jung, who's a professor at San Francisco State University. I may have mentioned this last time on he's the one who founded the Asian hate or Asians Against Hate. I don't remember the name of his organization. I apologize again for that too. Sorry, Russell. But I'll put a link to that also there. So we've had some of those conversations on the podcast there also. But one of the things about the Museum of Native American History or African American History, excuse me, is, it leads you from the bottom floor up, and it kind of chronicles the journey. And I don't know that I knew. I went there less than 2 years ago. I think not last summer, but the summer before that, as we're recording this now in October 1 of 2024. So this would be 2023. And I don't know that I knew the story of Emmett Till until I was confronted with it there. And, if you're not aware of the story of Emmett Till, and this would be interesting to put in the comments box whether you've heard the story of Emmett Till before or not. A 14-year-old African-American boy, he was from Chicago, and his mom's like, okay, you can go visit relatives down south in Mississippi, but you need to know how it works down in Mississippi. And he's like, oh, Mom, I'll be fine. And he wasn't fine.
Yeah.
And he went, the story is that he whistled at a white woman outside a store. And that was simply not acceptable. The woman's husband and his half brother abducted Emmett from his great uncle's home. They viciously beat him, gouged his eyes out, shot him in the head, dumped his body in the river, and they weighed it down with a cotton gin so it wouldn't be discovered. Well, his body was discovered 3 days later. The mom's like, where's he at? Where's he at? I don't know where he's at. They knew who had taken him, but the way justice was going to work, there was no way anybody was going to turn him in, because the story had circulated around town that he whistled at this white woman, and everyone knew it was her husband, but there was no way they could find any evidence for it at all. Then his body surfaced, and the only way they recognized it was his body was because he had a ring on that his mother had given him, I think, before he even went down there. And that's how they identified the body. Otherwise, it was marred beyond belief. So she had the body brought back to Chicago. And this is during, the 55. So before the civil rights movement was really going full bore. I guess maybe it had started already. And she said, we're doing an open casket so that people can walk by and see what happened to my son. I mean, it's like I said, the body was unrecognizable. And that just made national publicity. Like, this is what we experienced, or what they experienced. And it was just a symbol of the violence there. And, we could discuss the KKK and lynchings, and just the fact that justice was, if a black person did something to a white man, they would suffer the consequence. But if white people did it to a black person, there's almost no repercussions in many of these. I don't know if you know this, Danny, but there were lynchings in which they would produce postcards to advertise.
Yeah.
And then churches would get out early. And they'd have extra train cars so they could take the train to where the lynching was, so they can all celebrate this lynching. And it goes back again to the church's complicity, not only silence, but celebration of these things. And so again, we go to the modern riots, and we're like, yeah, that's wrong. But where were we when it happened against them? Right. Yeah, exactly. So,
I agree completely. It's, and I know that the tendency for people, because I've been in these conversations before, is to say, okay, that's all in the past, though. And I think there are other parts that we haven't talked about, or just touched on a little bit last time. But the implications of things, the war on drugs, which was the igniter of our modern day mass incarceration and stuff, because of the way it was disproportionately enforced among minority communities, and the social pathologies within those neighborhoods that was created by removing a generation of young men from that. And that's a different stuff. We talked about getting that into that, but that's a huge. My point is, though, that we had this. When I lived in Europe, I mean, maybe I can illustrate this way. When I lived in Europe, and we have a lot of conversations with my peers, Europeans, we talk about the difference between American attitudes and European. So I was there in the 80s and 90s. So the specter of World War II still loomed somewhat, because it was Cold War years and the division of Eastern and Western Europe. For those of you that are younger who don't know nothing about that history, sorry about that. But the Europe is still living under that specter of that. And one of the things that Europeans would say to us was that they both loved and didn't like about Americans was they loved Americans, quote unquote, can-do spirit. But what they also saw in that, though, is that they a very underappreciation for history, meaning that we tend to want to say that's in the past.
Yeah,
we have the freedom to go make new now. Let's go for it. And there's a wonderful truth about that. But what happens is when we don't deal with the past, we don't understand the threads that are still here in our current situation that are affecting some people's ability to actually move forward. And this is where this history of race comes into play for me. It's one thing for me to say, you know what, that's past and past. We've made great progress. Let's just keep going, and not understand that not everybody can say that. They have a history that has residual negative outcomes that they're dealing with, and we have to listen. Again, as we said over and over in all these things, we don't ask everybody to agree with us. We ask people, we hope that we encourage you to listen and to think.
Yeah, and go meet people and hear their stories.
Go meet people and hear their stories, for sure.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's finish up really quickly. One of the things I don't think we're doing a good job, because it's not a lived experience for either one of us, right, is understanding how this materializes on almost a day-to-day basis sometimes for some people, even today. We know I don't remember the gentleman, but he was jogging down the middle of the street and was shot by a few years ago. Just the ability to jog, the ability to go out. I remember Bishop Crudup, when he had that long conversation with me, just saying, Rob, he says, and take this for what it is. He's like, black people can't go hiking. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, Rob, you ever see a black person, on a hiking trail? I'm like, well, not usually. He's like, yeah, a black person's coming down the path with a backpack on, and you're suspicious. He says, this is just the cultural milieu. I thought that was interesting there. And again, if you're listening, and we thank you for Karen for your comments. She said, I'm assuming she's referring to the Tulsa riots. She said, I had never heard of them before. She said she's been to the place where Emmett Till was arrested in the courthouse, and the murders. By the way, the murderers were acquitted. Everybody knew they did it. And then later on, the murderers were paid for an interview, and they confessed, yeah, we did it. But because they'd already been tried and found innocent, they couldn't be found convicted. But what I found interesting in my research, or just really briefly, two things here just to mention, was the existence of sundown towns. And if you do a Google search on sundown towns, there's a map that shows you how many of them there were in the United States. And some of them are like, possibly a sundown town, likely a sundown town, a lot conglomeration of them in Ohio, Kentucky area. These are towns, like, they would literally have signs, and you can find these signs on images.google.com. Like, just type in sundown town, signs saying whites only after sundown, and signs like when the sun goes down, you better not be found here, and you know what I mean, or something. It's like unbelievable crimes. And the other thing was, it's like Route 66, the famous let's go for a drive. And the fact that people of color couldn't go for a drive on that road without the potential, like if they stopped at a gas station, it was for whites only, they were, or a hotel that wouldn't service them, they would actually pack in their car, like toiletries and things like that. So in case they couldn't find a restroom. And then there was a green book, and you can search on this as well, that was actually written so that blacks, when on Route 66, they knew what gas stations to stop at, what hotels to stop at, what places of restaurants, and where they could eat. It's like, you're kidding me that you can't just go for a drive and stop wherever you want and be that's unfathomable to me. But
I was going to say, if you read, and again, encourage people to read the book, The Warmth of Other Suns, where the author tells the stories of three different people, one from Florida, one from Mississippi, one from Louisiana, that migrated. The Florida man migrated to New York, to New England or New York, I can't remember. And then the Mississippi woman to Chicago. And the man from Louisiana was a doctor, a physician, black man. And he migrated to Los Angeles. And his story of driving from Louisiana through Texas and west out to Los Angeles includes some details of what you're talking about, where he couldn't. He actually drove, and experienced exactly what you're talking about along the way, not being able to buy gas, not being able to have a place to stay, because blacks weren't welcome in that.
All right. So on Thursday at 10 a.m., we're going to have a conversation with two gentlemen that you know. They're pastors in Compton. They're going to talk about some of this a little bit, their experiences, but what it's like having a multi-ethnic community and doing it right. And so look forward to that. And
I'm really excited about that.
Yeah.
I want
to add?
Yeah. Rob and I have laid a groundwork by just talking from our own experience and our own understanding of history. On Thursday, we're going to move forward and say, all right, let's talk about what it's like now and what are some of the ways that the church can actually have a redemptive presence in this whole in this space that we're talking about. So we're moving in a direction to say, okay, we've been talking about this. What do we do? And I think our conversation on Thursday, we'll learn some more about what the current situation is like on these issues, and
from people that it's their lived experience.
That's their lived experience. And we'll have both a Caucasian and an African-American guest with us who are partnered together in a multi-ethnic church and outreach ministry in the city of Compton, California.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation. And I hope that it will take what we've been saying theoretically and from our own experience and broaden it into, some concrete, this is what it looks like for the body of Christ to actually live this out.
Amen. Amen. Yeah. May thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Right. So thanks, Danny, for your time.
Yeah,
Thank
you too.
For those who are watching, we appreciate this. Please subscribe to our channel. And one last thing, Danny and I do this. We have said from the beginning that we are never going to hide anything we do, whether it's a podcast, a blog, a live stream behind a paywall. But we also don't get paid for this. So if you like and appreciate what we're doing and you want to contribute, please do so. Danny, we need to put a thing on the giving for like Rob and Danny so they can give and the money just goes to kind of both of us. But right now it's a drop down box for Rob, Danny, or Vinny. So if you want to divide it up and give $5 to Danny and $5 to Rob, that'd be great. But we thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you on Thursday, everyone.
All right. Take care. Bye.